Welcome to this explainer. We're going to explore something absolutely fascinating today. The idea that Western literature over the last 500 years isn't just some random collection of dusty old books. It's a living, breathing reaction to the history that happened right before it. Every great novel or poem you've ever read, it's basically a single piece in a centuries-long domino effect. So let's dive right in with a really fundamental question. Have you ever wondered why a 21st century novel doesn't read anything like a Shakespearean play? Why do the books we read keep fundamentally changing their entire vibe, their structure, their purpose? Well, it's not just because language evolves over time. It's actually because society itself keeps swinging back and forth, kind of like a giant pendulum. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Rebirth, Reason, and Rules. 2. The Romantic Rebellion. 3. Industry and Gritty Reality. 4. Shattered Worlds of Modernism. And finally, 5. The Postmodern Game. To get the full picture, our grand journey kicks off around the year 1500 with the Renaissance, and we'll track these major disruptions straight through to the present day. We are going to hit some absolutely critical pivot points in 1660, 1798, 1837, 1914, and 1945. Now, the crazy thing is, every single literary movement in history directly triggered the next one. It's this continuous, unbroken chain of action and reaction. Honestly, each era behaved almost exactly like a rebellious teenager, pushing back against the beliefs of its parents. They either took things way too far, or they completely failed to answer the big questions of their time. Okay, let's jump into Part 1, Rebirth, Reason, and Rules. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So, the Renaissance literally translates to rebirth, and it brought us this totally revolutionary concept called humanism. Think about it. For centuries, society had been strictly focused on religious devotion and, the afterlife. But humanism completely flipped the script. It moved society's gaze over to human potential and life right here on Earth. People started asking a really profound question. What does it actually mean to be human? And this era was just explosive. It was totally fueled by the game-changing invention of the printing press, which, for the first time, made books accessible to way more than just the ultra-rich. Because of this, literature just flourished. You had icons like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, who, fun fact, was actually a spy for the Queen, and they began to deeply explore complex human emotions, logic, and the incredible beauty of nature. Basically, for the first time in a long time, the individual actually mattered. But watch the pendulum swing. If the Renaissance was all about celebrating boundless human emotion and potential, well, by 1660, the Enlightenment showed up acting like the strict, logical parent. Also known as the Age of Reason, this new era flat-out rejected those wild, unchecked emotions. Instead, it demanded structure, science, order, and cold, hard intellect. Writers at the time, guys like Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and Daniel Defoe, they definitely did not believe in perfect human potential. In fact, they believed humanity was inherently flawed and desperately needed strict rules and common sense just to survive. This really structured mindset gave rise to the modern novel, thanks to Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, the creation of dictionaries, and the heavy use of biting satire to just, mock human stupidity. Moving on to Part 2, The Romantic Rebellion. Breaking the rules. Look, nobody likes being told to just sit down and follow the rules, right? So Romanticism arrived around 1798 as a total, unapologetic rebellion. It pushed back fiercely against the cold, calculated reason of the Enlightenment, and also against the ugly, polluting new factories of the Industrial Revolution. Romantics firmly believed that strong emotion, soaring imagination, and wild, untamed nature were the actual sources of beauty and truth. The writers of this era? Absolute rebellious geniuses. You've got people like Mary Shelley, who literally invented science fiction with Frankenstein when she was just a teenager. No way, right? And Edgar Allan Poe, who plunged deep into the dark and the supernatural. They valued raw feelings and intuition way above cold science. They focused heavily on the individual outcast, the rebel, the misunderstood genius, treating untamed nature almost like a sacred religion. All right, Part 3. Industry and Gritty Reality, the Victorian Era and Realism. So, as you might guess, that beautiful, romantic escape just couldn't last forever, especially once industrialization truly took over everyday life. The pendulum swings back hard. We enter the Victorian era, which really tried to mask massive, ugly social divides with this facade of strict public morality. But trailing right behind it was realism, which essentially grabbed that polite Victorian facade and stripped it away entirely to show life's gritty, unsugar-coated truth. First off, during Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, those booming factories and expanding cities created massive, unavoidable class divides between the wealthy and the poor. The novel actually became the ultimate tool for social critique. Writers like Charles Dickens tackled horrifying poverty and child labor head-on. But importantly, Victorian literature usually maintained a really clear distinction between good and bad. It offered readers a neat moral lesson, even amidst the crazy conflict between traditional religion and Charles Darwin's explosive new science. But then realism and naturalism step in and basically say, okay, enough with the fairy tales. Rejecting those neat, moral Victorian endings, realists like Mark Twain and naturalists like Thomas Hardy decided to show middle and lower class life exactly as it was. Naturalism even argued a much darker point called determinism, the idea that humans are shaped completely by their environment and genetics, often totally out of their own control. In this era, you're not getting any forced happy endings, just the objective, raw reality of everyday life. That brings us to part 4, Shattered Worlds of Modernism, Disillusionment and Experimentation. In 1914, the globe plunged into absolute chaos. Triggered by the unprecedented horror of World War I, writers felt like the world was fundamentally broken. To capture this shattered, fractured reality, modernists invented highly experimental techniques. Think stream of consciousness, a style of writing that completely ditches orderly paragraphs to mimic the chaotic, jumping, unfiltered flow of human thought. You have to understand, the modernists were deeply, deeply disillusioned. They were convinced that traditional values, religion, and the shiny American dream were all just lies that had led millions of young men into the meat grinder of the First World War. Icons like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Virginia Woolf, and James Joyce embraced this aggressive motto, make it new. They wrote about alienation, the meaninglessness of modern life, and they broke every traditional rule of writing by using nonlinear timelines that jumped back and forth entirely unpredictably. And finally, Part 5, The Postmodern Game, Irony and Pop Culture. After the devastating global trauma of World War II and the genuinely terrifying reality of the atomic bomb, this fascinating psychological shift occurred. While the modernists before them were profoundly depressed and devastated by the loss of universal meaning, the postmodernists took a completely different approach. They accepted the chaos. Instead of mourning the lack of absolute truth with a capital T, they leaned into dark humor, playfully accepted the absurdity of life, and started treating literature itself like an elaborate game. In this era, writers like Kurt Vonnegut and Margaret Atwood lean heavily, and I mean heavily, into irony and sarcasm. They absolutely love using unreliable narrators, where you can't even trust the person telling you the story. They mix high art, like classic poetry, with low art, like comic books and pop culture. And they really popularized metafiction, which is when the story actually knows it's a story, actively breaking the fourth wall to talk directly to you, the reader. And that brings us to where we currently sit in the grand pendulum swing of literary history. It's been quite the ride, right? From the rebirth of the Renaissance, through the strict rules of the Enlightenment, the emotional rebellion of the Romantics, the gritty truths of the Realists, the shattered experiments of the Modernists, all the way to the playful irony we read today. Which brings us to the end of this explainer. Since we've clearly seen that every single era is a direct rebellion against the one that came just before it, I want to leave you with a thought. If postmodernism is all about irony, treating truth like a game, and mixing high and low culture, what do you think the next great literary movement will look like? What are tomorrow's writers going to rebel against? Thanks so much for joining me today, and hey, keep questioning what you read.